there, my name is Shane Craddock, and this is the Inner Edge podcast, where I share a different take on how to lead and live a sustainable, high-performance life. Over the course of different episodes, I'm going to challenge the belief that tension, stress, and struggle are essential to success and creativity. My experience is that there's an easier way, there's a better way, and indeed there's an essential way that we need to explore for the times that we live in. So let's go ahead, let's jump in and explore. Hi there, welcome to today's episode. I think the topic of today, I suppose, was inspired by what's unfortunately going on this week as I'm recording this podcast. So it's a terrible situation with Ukraine being invaded by Russia. So it's probably the main topic of conversation with people that I'm connected with this week, and certainly on most people's minds. Not just at the difficulty around it, but also on the impact it's going to have on the world in different ways, particularly commercially. And so the title for today's podcast was originally going to be about rocks in the jar, which if you know me, you'll know what that means. If you don't know me, you won't know what that means. If you don't know what that means, go onto YouTube, Google, or put into YouTube, rocks in the jar, Shane Craddock, and you'll get a video and it'll tell it. A very powerful metaphor story that I think you'll enjoy. But I will come back to it, if not next week, perhaps the week after. So the title for today is I suppose, is obviously war. It's winning the war within. Now, it has been, though, inspired by what's going on with Ukraine. And I just, hopefully you'll see the connection as we go through this. But it's a very difficult situation that's happening. And there's, our planet has had a history of humans fighting humans and humans trying to take each other's lands. Ireland has got its own history around that. So maybe we're very sensitive as well to any other external country trying to invade a country of people. So I guess, we'd have our own view on that, historical as much as present. But the real war to win, and it does affect the external world, the external wars. The war to win is the one that's within you, that's within me, that's within all of us. And there is a war going on. And I think that's what I want to lean into today. And, before the Ukrainian situation, I think if you ask most people what's the single biggest challenge, aside from the COVID pandemic we've just gone through, what would you think is the single biggest challenge for our planet? I think most people will probably say, look, it's climate change. And I don't believe that that's the case. Because I think the problem, maybe our biggest problem perhaps is climate change, but the cause of that is actually the bigger issue. And to me, you can say, well, it's, the fossil fuel industry or it's capitalism or whatever else. And really, I think you can track it all the way back to our inner climate or the inner climate of people, because really it's down to the ego. The ego is the problem, and we all have an ego, Shane included. And I think the ego is the problem. Now, an ego has got uses, so I'm not against the ego, because also it's part of who we are in our inner worlds, and that's what I'm interested in in this podcast. The different parts that are inside our inner world. But the ego is definitely in there, and it is a problem because you can recognize the ego because it is divisive. It is divisive, and it also wants more. It wants to be better than everybody else, and it sees itself as better than everybody else. And so that's why you have, for example, somebody like Putin saying, well, I want this and I want that. To me, that's ego-driven. Same thing if you're looking at perhaps what is considered pure capitalism, and I'm not against capitalism, obviously, at all, because that's, I guess, the world that I live in. I think there's a lot of good that comes out of capitalism, maybe more than other types of things. But the ego is an issue because ultimately, if I want more and I want more consumer goods, ultimately that's what's driving the engine that is capitalism, that's causing perhaps the major problem with our climate. It's about greed. It's about wanting more. But what's that about? So now what is happening right now is that there is a major shift going on the inner worlds of people. Without a doubt, there is a movement that has already started and it's underway and we're in the middle of it, and there is a transition. But the war to win in this transition is the one inside yourself. That's really where I would be directing people, is that if you work on yourself and win that war inside yourself and start to understand the subtle ways, the sneaky ways that the ego can infiltrate your world, and it already has in different ways. No matter how self-aware you think you are, I was I was joking with somebody there during the week that I definitely would have been somebody who would have considered myself years ago, oh yeah, I'm definitely self-aware. And as you go along in life, certainly I've realized, wow, was I deluded? There's no point in saying anything like that anymore, because there's so much more I don't know about myself and about the world. I'm still exploring. So when you say I'm very self-aware, that's a dangerous thing to say, because to me, that's probably your ego. And I'll often say this when I bring up self-awareness, if I'm doing a talk for a company or at a keynote or something like that, and you mention the word self-awareness, guaranteed one, if not two people afterwards will come up to me and say, yeah, I'm very self-aware. I just deal in my business or my life with a host of unself-aware people. They're really just the opposite of that. How do you deal with that? And that to me is just hilarious, because I recognize myself in that. But that's your ego talking. Because somebody who's genuinely self-aware just wouldn't even get into that. It's just a very different perspective. And that also is an example of, you think you're winning a war because I'm self-aware, but actually you've been hoodwinked by your ego. And that is the problem. That's a big problem. And that also causes then situations in the outer world that you think you're not causing, but actually you are. Because I've no doubt that Putin thinks he's doing the right thing probably for himself and for his country. I've no doubt he's probably got a version of that in there, even though it's not in line with what's best for humanity. I think we can all agree on that. But would you say there's anybody around him that he would let give him feedback? I doubt it. I'm sure that they might have a sad demise, or they might be taken away somewhere and put in a locked room or a locked cell with bars. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there in the real world. Because I've noted that already, even in Russia, unusually, there's a lot of protests around this war, which is really good to see. But I'd be concerned. We'll see what happens in that context. I'm not too sure Putin would like that. And that to me, again, is the ego. So in terms of bringing it back to this week again with clients, I spoke to a few clients, understandably, who told me that they were worried about the changes that this invasion, this war was going to cause in terms of increases in prices, issues with energy. Already energy prices have gone up. And so if you're, for example, a business owner or somebody who's directly affected by things like that, well, then sure, why wouldn't your inner voice get worried? The issue, though, you have to remember is that it's really important to be able to not get caught up with that. And above all else, and I think this is one of the biggest tools you have in your armory, your inner armory, is the day that you realize 100% that your inner voice isn't you. It is not you. Now, most people that I know that might be listening to this might have a little bit of awareness around that, but I don't know if they really understand properly that it's 100% not you. It's a different type of conversation about, well, what is the voice, where it's coming from? And it's coming from things like your ego and your memory and things like that, but it's not you. And so when you understand that it's kind of like having somebody beside you giving advice, but they're not you, I think it changes your perspective. And I think, what I'd be saying to my clients this week very much is, apart from trying to take them out of the magnetism of that inner narration. And it's not that you don't deal with reality, because actually we want to get into reality, but reality is not in your inner voice. And so I would say, you do your scenario planning, you manage risk, you look at the worst case scenario, and you have plans and everything else around that. That is practical. But you'll do that very much better when you have a very clear mind. And that clear mind is a mind that is not attached to its inner voice. Now, it's funny, somebody said to me recently, I was chatting about a little bit about this, and they said, I'm actually very good in difficult situations. Especially if I'm in a situation with somebody where maybe there's conflict, or maybe they're being rude or whatever. I just don't react. I'm actually quite good in it. And so I was listening to them. I said, that's not true. And they said, what do you mean? It is true. I said, no, you're confusing reacting in the moment externally to reacting inside. And I said, my bet is, if you think about it now for a moment, that fair enough, on the external, you're like the swan gliding gracefully on the surface of the water, but underneath, you're paddling like hell, i.e., There's all sorts of explosions happening inside you. You're just not showing it to the other person. And of course, they said, yeah, well, actually, that's true. And not only that, then they said, when I go home and for the next few days, I might be replaying that whole scene in my mind, winding myself up, creating this incredible war inside myself. And I said, yeah, well, that's really the issue. I'd rather we get to the point where you're in the situation which is difficult, and inside yourself it's still water. That's possible. And maybe you need to hear that it actually is possible to be inside yourself, hear something very difficult, but actually be calm. And that's where you have to protect your inner world and stand up to any sort of mental invasion. And that's what we're seeing, I think, with Ukraine this week, is that the people there are saying, no, we will do whatever we have to stop this invasion. And I think I'm even with a little bit, and I haven't got into all the stories around it, but with the little bit that I've heard or that I might have read, I've been very inspired by the defiance. And I think that defiance is something that I will take and say, yeah, well, that's the way you need to be inside yourself to stop the invasion of external thoughts, of your ego ruling the show, or somebody else, like an external bully. Like, there are external bullies, we all know them, but also there's an inner bully even. That's your inner voice. At times it can beat you up. It can tell you where you're going wrong. It can be very critical of you. That is bully action. That's the war you want to win. So I suppose, as you know, I'll always kind of come into the final lap of this podcast episodes with some questions. So a few questions for you for today and this week is, okay, who can you challenge, first of all, in the external world? Who can you challenge around you that maybe needs to hear a little bit of reality check around, listen, you need to stop doing this behavior. You need to tell them. I mean, if more people were able to step up and push back against someone like Putin, and maybe that's hopefully what will happen, we'll see. It doesn't matter whether they listen to you or not. You need to be the one who tells them. After that, we'll see what happens. And then also, I think, in your life and your work, where can you stand strong? Usually people listening to this kind of a podcast are probably, I would think, very strong already. But maybe there's an area where you need to be stronger. And then I think most importantly, where possibly in your life is your inner bully running riot? And it's a rare person who doesn't have an inner bully. And I think it's equally kind of go, do you know what? Who's in charge in here? Is it me or my inner voice? And sometimes you have to go, listen, inner voice, get back in your box. Get back in your box. And so instead of believing your inner voice, what if you didn't? What if you started to see it like I do as being something that's separate to you, something to be managed, something that I have a choice about whether I listen to or not? So where can you be brave also? And speaking of bravery, just in case, it's always good to have a few people in your life that you can kind of go to say, hey, is there anywhere that I need to get some feedback or reality check? That can be difficult. And most people listening to this podcast probably won't do this. But go to somebody and say, listen, is there some place where I'm dropping the ball or I'm causing a problem, I don't see it, or where maybe my ego is out of whack? Can you tell me? It doesn't mean you have to kind of believe it, but I think it's important to hear it. So, as you've guessed, I think from this episode, for me, the way I see it is the war to win really is the one within. And I will come back to this again in different ways, because ultimately it's really probably at the core of what the premise of this podcast is about, the inner edge, is that the way to win is to work on yourself. And if you can work on yourself, whatever that means, even as you're hearing it today, then you're more inclined to win. But when you win, it's the kind of winning that improves the world. We all win together. It's not just about you. It's not just about me. It's about collective winning. And I think that's the age that we're moving into. But like all change, it doesn't come without pain. Okay. Hi there. Before you go, I'm just outside here. It might be a bit windy. You may hear around me. Before you go, listen, if you like the episode, I'd appreciate if you could share it with somebody that you think it might make a difference to, or even give it a little rating. It does help, and I'm just trying to, I suppose, increase the awareness of things like this, the inner edge, to more and more people. So I'll leave it in your good hands. Always appreciate it. Have a good week. C'est la vie. Thanks for being with me. Bye-bye.